is a Fern by James Merriweather. Assistance for people new to pteridology, which is the study of and enthusiasm for ferns, club mosses, quillworts and horsetails. This presentation is an extra help supplement to the new Wild Guide, Britain's Ferns. In spring, the number one indicator of what is a fern is the characteristic way the leaves, which we know as fronds, unroll. Few other of the world's plants behave in this way, and none of those occur wild in Britain. Here we see the fronds of lemon-scented fern in the process of unrolling, following this sequence from fiddlehead or crozier below left to fully expanded. And here we see a similar sequence in the single fronds of bracken, from emergence via unravelling to full spread. So, in spring at least, we can rely on ferns to give themselves away by their uncurling fronds. It's later in the season when difficulties can occur. A problem sometimes encountered by Wild Guide users when they first set out to identify a fern can be their inability, temporary I assure you, to detect differences between some ferns and certain flowering plants. Problems arise when flowers are absent or not obviously attached to the leaves in question, while the plant's general appearance is superficially fern-like. This presentation is a response to comments submitted by a user of my Wild Guide who was new to ferns and found page 15 lookalikes did not address the problems he encountered. Having been a fern enthusiast since 1967, I have no difficulty instantly telling ferns and non-ferns apart without having to think about it. I just know by an acquired instinct we call jizz. Anybody can get it, but at first it might take a little assistance. I fully appreciate that beginners will have to cultivate this intuition the same way as I must have done, though I no longer remember, 50 plus years ago, so I will do my best to provide a comprehensive guide. If I've identified a too obvious difference or overlooked a problematical comparison, please let me know so that I can refine this guide accordingly. In attempting to understand what gives Wild Guide users difficulty, I've been out just looking at plants to try to recognize potential problems. Undoubtedly, leaves of umbellifers such as the common cow parsley surely have a buckler fern-like appearance, but what about others? For instance, do the once divided, that is pinnate, leaves of silverweed seem superficially like polypody? Do similar cautions apply to the basal leaves of valerian? Are the less finely cut leaves of small Angelica as confusing as those of other umbellifers such as cow parsley, of which there are quite a few? It is unfortunate that florists call the decorative leaves they use in bouquets and buttonholes fern. Of course it is nothing of the sort. It's asparagus. Any plant with leaves so finely dissected as to have filamentous segments can be ignored because no fern fronds are like that. Instantly dismissing such plants is perhaps the first stage in developing the skill of recognizing ferns without being distracted by non-ferns. All British ferns grow from ground level. Although their rhizome takes different forms, our ferns never have a trunk or vertical stem. Here, possibly, is the trickiest cause of uncertainty. Cow parsley, or several other members of the flowering plant family Apiaceae, the umbellifers, and the buckler ferns, notably broad buckler fern, which is very common and often occupies habitats that overlap with cow parsley. Once this distinction has been grasped, recognition of the other less frequently encountered buckler ferns should follow automatically. But be warned, not put off I hope, that once you get into identification of the buckler ferns, even without flowering plant confusions, you will still have quite enough on your plate to keep you occupied. Umbellifer leaves are distinctly triangular, while buckler fern fronds are at best only just triangular and usually sub-triangular. Here is a comparison of a flowering plant, cow parsley, and a similar fern, the common broad buckler fern. If it helps, check other nearby plants. The umbellifer has flowers or seed heads, while the other has spore-producing structures, sori, at the back of the frond. If flowers are present, then you know it's not a fern. If not, turn several leaves or fronds over to see if they have sori. Aware that I can't read minds, I'm almost reluctant to present this flowering plant fern pairing. Still, it might prove to be a useful comparison. Firstly, I'm not sure anybody could be fooled by Angelica to think that it could be a fern, but I have to acknowledge that possibility. Then, although Angelica might have a bluish tinge, the blueness of this shaded example is a photographic artifact which I failed to remedy with Photoshop. Angelica usually shows as green as bracken. However, these pictures do illustrate major useful differences between umbellifers and ferns. Umbellifers have inflated leaf bases and vertical stems. Fern fronds have no sheathing leaf bases and emerge from stems, known as rhizomes, at or below ground level. In some umbellifers, such as Angelica, the leaf sheaths are conspicuous, grossly inflated, while in others, e.g. cow parsley, they are no more than flattened wings that you have to go looking for. At first, people might find differentiating leaves of non-flowering umbellifers and fern fronds, but probably not for long. Here are small Angelica and Bracken side by side. And here, young Angelica alongside broad buckler fern. Here, cow parsley and Bracken are compared once again. And here, cow parsley and a frond of a buckler fern. Once divided, what we call pinnate leaves of flowering plants might for a short while be indistinguishable from fronds of pinnate ferns such as hard fern, especially when juvenile, and the polypodes. As well as lacking flowers, young hard fern has no giveaway sori, but polypody surely does, so check behind the fronds. Is this strap-leafed plant hart's tongue fern? When you get to know hart's tongue, this habitat will instantly tell you no. Turn the leaves to look for sori, none. And the smell? Well, this time it's wild garlic, which you can't possibly get wrong when it's in flower. Two plants of the woodland floor, which at first might be mistaken, particularly when viewed from above. Here is a comparison showing a particular flowering plant leaf and fern frond similarity. Please note that the herb robert leaves are generally smaller than oak fern fronds, which have been reduced here to fit everything in the frame. Oak fern fronds, with their circular sori, arise individually from a ground-level creeping rhizome. Herb robert leaves are arranged along aerial but not particularly upright stems and are usually accompanied by magenta flowers or long pointed cranesbill seed pods. Common adder's tongue often hides in the grass, as does Hoary Plantain, which has very similar leaves. Adder's tongue has a single midrib and an upright structure bearing 2 rows of sporangia. The plantain has several leaf veins, 3 or more, and its upright structure has inconspicuous flowers or seed pods arranged spirally. Two common woodland mosses mimic fern fronds rather well. However, the distinguishing factor is easy, scale. Moss fronds never grow longer than an inch or two, the size of only the very smallest juvenile ferns, and they form extensive cushions, whereas the ferns for which they might be mistaken are quite clearly separate plants. The first of these fern-like mosses is Hylocomium splendens, with its conspicuous red stalks. The other is green all over Thuidium tamariscinum, seen in 2 situations. Here, alone, except for a few bits of Hylocomium and other mosses. And here with a fern growing with it, among it in the same cushion. But the fern growing among the fern-like moss fronds is less fern-like than the moss. It is a filmy fern, Wilson's. Here is the same Wilson's filmy fern growing with a thoroughly unfern-like plant, the leafy liverwort Bassania trilobata. For scale, the width of this picture is only a couple of inches. In this picture, the filmy fern is more luxuriant than the mosses and liverworts in its company. And here it is almost a monoculture, magnified and then magnified once more to show the little pods that enclose the sporangia, the spore-producing bodies. Observe that the fronds, apart from their veins, are very thin, translucent, indeed only a cell in thickness. Hence the name hymenophyllum, meaning membrane leaf. Also note the little grey bubbles at frond tips, which are uncurling croziers described at the beginning of this presentation. If we don't examine our botanical finds critically, several aquatic plants might be mistaken for either of Britain's fully aquatic quillworts. Don't let them fool you. Here on a lake bottom, not far from shore, but always underwater, are common quillwort and water lobelia together. Seen in situ, they look quite similar. However, when they have been lifted and placed side by side, the differences are clearly seen. And eventually, of course, the lobelia gives itself away by flowering. The worst offender is perhaps shoreweed. The difference is in the name. This quillwort look-alike grows on lake shores, sometimes inundated, sometimes out of the water. Quillworts are always underwater. Section a leaf of each and the difference is clear. Shoreweed leaves are packed with large cells occupying a single leaf-long chamber. Quillwort leaves consist of 4 parallel hollow channels with occasional cross walls. Fern identification itself can be quite tricky. For that, please refer to the Wild Guide Britain's Ferns, but it might be useful to avoid a couple of common difficulties people encounter, but only as beginners. The number one difficulty seems to be in telling apart the fronds of hard fern and polypody. Probably the best check is to compare the way the segments decline towards the base of the frond. In hard fern, these pinnae get dramatically smaller and smaller, which they don't in polypody. Also, hard fern has its fronds clustered rosette-like, whereas polypody fronds, arising from a creeping rhizome, spread around. The second frequently experienced difficulty is finding holly fern where holly fern never grows. It is interesting how often people discover the rare holly fern in lowland habitats, particularly in woodland. What they're actually finding are juvenile plants of the hard shield fern, which can look very similar until you get your eye in. When finding such plants, the first consideration should always be habitat. Holly fern grows in open upland habitats. Here it is on an ancient volcanic crag at an altitude of around 500 metres, and here growing on upland limestone. In contrast, hard shield fern grows in damp, shady situations, though also on open limestone, but the problem usually occurs in the woodland setting. Having inspected the frond undersides for sori, absent in juvenile shield ferns yet present in all but the smallest holly ferns, look around. There are bound to be adult hard shield ferns nearby, and you will soon find intermediates to demonstrate how the holly fern-like pinnae of juveniles divide more and more deeply as the plant matures until they are fully divided. At first, pinnae of adult holly and juvenile shield ferns are deceptively similar. The fronds develop from simply pinnate, that is divided once, to bipinnate, divided twice, and no longer resemble holly fern at all. When you get to know them, ferns are not only different from their apparent lookalikes, but also from each other and can be recognized and named at a glance. Of course, for confident classification, casual jizz observations of this sort require proper diagnosis, ideally facilitated by the Wild Guide to Britain's Ferns. Here is a roadside group of ferns which I jizz identified for this presentation, with an explanation of how jizz worked for me. Some are very alike, but can still be differentiated quite quickly. Number 1, top left. Doesn't everybody recognise Bracken at a glance? 2, top right, golden male fern. Narrow frond with a glossy finish, yellowish or golden with ginger hairs on the midrib, which all enhances its ungreen appearance. The smallest segments, the pinnules, are plain and rounded. 3, bottom left. Borer's male fern, greener than the golden male fern and not glossy. Pinnules square-tipped with, look closer, conspicuous acute teeth. 4, bottom right, common male fern, very like Borer's, but its pinnules have serrated margins and contract to a narrow rounded tip. 5, top left, lady fern, similar frond to the 3 preceding male ferns, but the pinnules are more dissected, almost to the midrib. In open situations, the pinnule margins are curled back. 6, top right, broad buckler fern, also more dissected than the male ferns, and pinnules with curled back margins, but the frond is broad, thrice divided, and almost triangular. Bottom left and right, in the same situation, but not on this occasion, we might also find the lemon-scented fern and yet another of those often baffling male ferns, the narrow male fern. Be ready, if you get into them, to be perplexed by the male ferns. Finally, if you stick to their identification key, horsetails are not too difficult, but please don't blame all 8 of them for being noxious weeds. Only field horsetail is ever really problematical, and it's not mare's tail, as the gardening gurus tend to name it erroneously, which is the flowering plant Hipparis vulgaris, which grows on stream beds with its green parts above water. Only water horsetail grows in a similar habitat, and it's very different.